If you're interested in Thelema and in the perspective of a contemporary practitioner on the matter, please stay tuned because we have a special guest today. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Angela Puca and this is my symposium. I'm a PhD and a university lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of Magick, Paganism, Shamanism, Thelema, and all things occult. As you know, this channel delivers academic scholarship on the topics that I just mentioned. And so far, I have only interviewed academics for on this channel. But today it is the start of a new day, the start of a new series, actually, where I will be interviewing also practitioners. And I thought this could be quite interesting for you to watch, so that you can have an academic and a practitioner in conversation. And it could be a way of picking into the even how fieldwork works for academics. When we go on fieldwork and we interview practitioners, how we try and understand how practitioners define their practices, conceptualize things. So hopefully this will be interesting. And please help me in welcoming Georgina Rose, also known as that darling.
Hello.
Hello, Georgina. How are you, first of all?
Doing quite well. It's a nice morning here where I live. It's nice and warm. The summer's sort of coming through, and I'm excited to talk to you about Thelema. I am not an academic. I am just a practitioner. So I think it'll be cool to see both ends of this conversation.
Yes, absolutely. I think it will be fascinating. Would you mind introducing yourself for the audience, so that they know you in case they're not familiar with you?
Of course. I'm Georgina Rose. I go by .darling on the internet, DAAT, like the Sephora, not like the textile pattern. I make YouTube videos, podcasts, all related to Thelema. I'm a practicing Thelemite. I've been a Thelemite for quite a number of years. And beyond Thelema, I explore just kind of wider Western esoteric traditions. I'm a practitioner first, and I basically talk about my experiences and what I've seen in people who practice and what I've sort of read. And I just sort of share that knowledge so that it's accessible, because I find a lot of Thelemic resources are not very accessible to new people. So I wanted to try to make that a bit more accessible, because that's where my end is. It's helping get people to actually practice. So that's what I do, and that's who I am.
So if people are interested, if they are practitioners or interested in a practitioner's perspective and are interested in Thelema, they can subscribe to your channel, TikTok, Instagram, and your social media more generally.
Yeah.
So the first question that I'd like to ask you is, how did you get into Thelema?
Yeah, so like most people getting into Thelema, I didn't first see what Thelema is. I sort of had a gateway in from another occult practice. I find that's pretty common. And for me, what really sort of spurred me getting interested in the occult is I was actually looking at like self-help, self-improvement stuff. I was trying to like better myself as a person. And I started sort of thinking about religion. And I was like, well, I was raised Protestant Christian, and I was like, this doesn't really click in my brain. There's certain things about it that don't make quite sense to me. So I started exploring ideas, and I came across like folksy, witchy, pagan stuff first. I think that's a bit more accessible. So that's what I personally came across first. Like when I went to the public library, like that's what was there. And then I started looking deeper and deeper, and I came across Richard Cavendish's book, The Black Arts, which is this occult book from the 70s. It's very 70s, I'll just say that. But it was the first time I heard about ceremonial magic, and I was like, this is cool. I want to do this. How do I do this? And so I sort of went down this like research rabbit hole, and I came across Thelema and Crowley, and I was like, I kind of agree with a lot of this. I'm sort of philosophically already aligned. And so then I started trying out the rituals, doing things like the Star Ruby and whatnot. It sort of worked. It made sense. And so now I'm a Thelemite, and that's sort of how I entered into it. And I've just gone deeper and deeper with time and really fallen in love with the tradition.
And what is about Thelema that attracts you the most?
Yeah, so one of the big things is a difference between Thelema and some other Western magical traditions is that Thelema, you're doing all the magic for like a specific reason. And I really like that there's a strong philosophic underpinning to it. When you're doing workings in Thelema, you're doing it with the goal of discovering or getting in alignment with your true will, which is sort of I don't know how to say purpose in life. I think that's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's essentially what you're supposed to be doing with your life to inevitably connect with the divine, right? And I like that because what you're doing has a purpose to it and a goal. I find Thelema as well, since it's been around for a while, there's sort of a trajectory you can follow. I mean, you don't have to follow it super rigidly, but it gives a direction. And I think a lot of the sort of contemporary, especially the online occult community, it lacks that like underpinning of like, okay, so I'm doing these rituals, but what is the end? And you'll notice this, and even when we say will, which is like a sort of meal blessing thing that Thelemites do, you have to what end? And I like that. I like that Thelema has a purpose and a reason, because I think without that, at least for me, I felt a little aimless. I was like, what am I doing this for? And so that's part of why I really like Thelema as well. I agree with just a lot of it. And I find the rituals are very beautifully structured. I like how they are done for a reason. And there's a sort of formulaic quality to certain aspects of it. So that's why I am really into Thelema.
Mm. And do you practice in a group or by yourself?
I'm mostly solitary, but there are times when I do group rituals. Like I know other Thelemites, so I've done group ritual, but the bulk of my practice is solitary.
Would you, in your experience, do you think that the majority of Thelemites in the contemporary world are solitary, or do they practice in groups?
I think majority are actually solitary. There's really hard to get numbers on this. I've tried so hard to find like statistics on Thelema. I know Mann Hindenburg White did one estimate, and I don't remember exactly what her estimate was about how many Thelemites there were, but even then, like, it's just really hard to get statistics on Thelema because a lot of people are not public about being Thelemites for, fear of backlash or fear of repercussions in their lives, because Crowley's controversial. I think we all sort of know that if you're familiar with Thelema.
Yes. So. Well, I only did a couple of videos and I got a taste of that. So yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of Thelemites are super open about it. I know a lot of Thelemites in my city, and some of them, like, you would never know. So it's just so hard to get numbers. I think the bulk are solitary because I've seen numbers on like online forums about Thelema, and I've talked to a lot of Thelemites where I would say the majority are not in groups. I think that's a newer trend though.
That's what I was interested in. The fact that this is a trend that is also present in paganism, and it's interesting to see that in Thelema as well. Paganism in the wider sense, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a new trend, because for a long time, I would say most Thelemites were part of a specific group called the OTO. There are a couple of Thelemic groups in the US. There's not just the OTO, but that was sort of big one. But that's not as true now. And I think that that's really because of things like the internet and accessibility. I think much like Wicca in the 90s, right? There's a lot more accessible material, so a lot more people go solitary. And as well, another reason why I think a lot of people are solitary is less that materials thing, but also just there aren't that many Thelemites. So if you live in a smaller area, it's harder to find a local group. So I think it's a variety of factors, but I think the majority are solitary. And I think that solitary statistic is rising with time.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. And what do you think is the relation that Thelemites usually have with the figure of Aleister Crowley?
Yeah, so this is one that's going to actually vary depending on who you're talking to pretty radically. For me, I have a lot of reverence for Crowley. I have my painting of him. Yes. Semi-ironically, it's kind of funny to me. I watched Strange Angel, and if you've ever seen the show,
I've seen it,
a picture of Crowley in his house, which no Thelemites actually do that, so I got one just to be funny. But it depends. There are some people who like revere Crowley and see him very, very highly. And those people are sort of the extreme of that spectrum. Some people even sort of mock that perspective in certain ways because they say, well, Thelema is about your will, not about Crowley's will. There's even a term called Crowleyanity, which is sort of a pejorative for someone who sees Crowley as like a Jesus figure and really tries to be Crowley, which is not what you're supposed to do in Thelema. Then there's the middle perspective, which is personally where I fall, right? Crowley was someone who tapped into this current and really began something, but he's not like some infallible Jesus prophet figure. He's someone who is a very wise and talented magician, but he's not like imperfect. He's not perfect, excuse me. He is someone who really tapped into the current, because Thelema is very much a current. So there's that perspective. And then there's the perspective that Crowley should be decentered from Thelema entirely. This is a newer perspective where they're like basically trying to like pull Crowley out of Thelema in a way. Those are the people who are the most critical of Crowley. And so you see Thelemites along the spectrum. I think my perspective is probably the more common one you'll see, but there definitely are people on either wing with that one.
Do you think that that evolved over time? Is it like a new development of the perception of Crowley in Thelema, or do you think that it has always been like that?
It's a newer development. I find the people on this really far side who are trying to decenter Crowley, that's very new. That's like a this decade thing. My perspective has been around for a long time, and the really highly revering Crowley's perspective, you see it mostly with older people that I've talked to. So Crowley's definitely becoming more, I don't know if criticized is the right, more nuancedly looked at. I'm not sure exactly how to phrase it, but you definitely notice a change in how he's being viewed when you look at newer people. So it's interesting, and it does vary depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you can see a difference between older Thelemites and younger Thelemites, because yeah, they could highlight that it is indeed a development, or it could be a different generational approach to Thelema as well. Well, which could also imply that it is a newer development. So yeah, that's interesting. Another thing that I thought that strikes me as quite interesting is that I noticed that you identify as a pagan. And I was just having dinner last Monday with Professor Ronald Hutton, and we were talking about paganism. And I was actually mentioning this, the fact that there are Thelemites that identify as pagans. And since in pagan studies, usually the perspective is that paganism is an earth-based religion. And usually I'd say that Thelema tends to be seen more in the realm of ceremonial magic, Western esotericism. So I'm fascinated by how come you identify as a pagan? How come you see Thelema as part of paganism? Because that could help enrich the understanding of how contemporary practitioners use the term pagan, and how and why they identify as one.
Yeah, I think it really depends on what you define pagan as, because I've noticed the academic definition isn't always the definition people in the pagan community are running with. I've seen arguments that like pagan equals polytheism, which in that case you can sort of argue Thelema is pagan. You can argue the whole like pagan community take, because Thelema, if you go to like Thelemic groups, you'll notice that there's a heavy overlap in like events and membership with like Wiccan groups and traditional witchcraft groups. And you'll notice that some Thelemites will like celebrate the Wheel of the Year or worship other deities and do things outside of Thelema proper. And so I think once you get into like the individual aspect, it gets more complicated. I do think Thelema does not follow the like academic definition of paganism. I think it really depends on what you're saying pagan is. I self-identify as a pagan because I incorporate paganism into my Thelemic practice. And I share a lot of space with people who are pagans. So I say I'm pagan because of the stuff I do that's sort of outside of the Thelemic ritual sort of canon, if you want to call it that. But yeah, whether Thelema is pagan or not is like kind of a debate. I know there's an article on Hermetic Library somewhere about it that was written by a Thelemic, I think they were a priest. It's a very interesting one. And it just basically lists all the definitions of paganism and argues, is Thelema this and this? And the sort of final answer of the article was, well, it depends on what you think paganism is, if Thelema is pagan or not. Because in ways it is, in ways it's not. But it's not the like traditional academic definition of paganism by any means. I wouldn't make that argument.
Well, yeah, on the matter of the academic definition of paganism, usually when paganism is defined by anthropologists of religion, of course we will talk more about this on the interview that I will do for your channel, where we will welcome more the academic perspective. But the academic definitions of paganism, or indeed other religious contemporary practices, can change over time. And usually in anthropology at the moment anthropology studies it's different from history of religion, because instead of looking at the documents and historical developments, anthropology tends to study what contemporary practitioners do and how they define the practice. So now with something like paganism, you have many different views on what constitutes paganism. So how do you find a definition as an academic when you have such a variety of and such a diversity of definitions? And usually what we use, a methodology that is now commonly used and quite popular among academics, is discourse analysis and identifying patterns of meaning that emerge from the community when they talk about a specific subject, in this case, the definition of paganism. So what ends up being the definition of paganism when you use this methodology is not going to represent every single individual, but it will represent the pattern of meaning that the community is creating around this term. So you could say what the majority thinks in a way, but it's a bit more nuanced. So yeah, this is a very long-winded way of saying that the academic definition of paganism will change over time, because paganism is an ongoing tradition that is changing quite quickly. And it is growing, and it is also growing, and there are more and more people identifying as pagans, and that, of course, will affect the definition of paganism itself. So that's why I thought it was interesting, because it can allow scholars to better understand how practitioners use this term. So yeah. And for instance, in your case, what is your definition of paganism that allows you to say that you are a Thelemite and hence, and as well, a pagan?
Yeah, so my sort of definition of pagan is that it broadly refers to non-Abrahamic traditions that incorporate certain common practice aspects. I think the polytheism thing is very relevant. I think there are other things like nature of an ancestor can come in, but I think those are like patterns and tendencies. But I use pagan in a very broad, big tent sense, right? I don't, when I talk about someone who's a pagan, I typically am going to use some sort of sub-identifier under it to know exactly what they're doing, because I think paganism has become a very broad, umbrella term, more so than a term that really identifies specifically what that means for an individual. Like if someone tells me they're a pagan and I'm meeting them, I'm like, okay, what do you actually do? What do you mean by that? Because I found that paganism has become a very broad term. I know that's a little different than sort of the academic definition, which I can imagine for you guys keeping up with what people are saying is very difficult.
Yes.
It seems like the discourse, I sometimes struggle following all the discourse. It seems like it's moving like 10 miles a minute. So I can imagine it's tricky for you guys to sort of keep up with all the different perspectives, because I think there are multiple, you can make multiple arguments, in my opinion, for a good definition of paganism. I don't know exactly what the perfect definition would be that would work for everyone. So I can imagine that's tricky for you guys.
Yes, it definitely is. Especially when you study something like paganism or contemporary esoteric practices, because they are non-dogmatic usually. And so not having a central authority or a central dogma, you don't have a cohesive theology. And even in cases where there is a very stable theoretical foundation, you will still find that different practitioners will articulate it in a very individual way. So I'd say that this sort of individualization of the practice is very common across the board when it comes to magic practicing traditions. So that makes it harder to study as an academic, but I don't mind the challenge, and I think it allows even social science to advance in a way to, to sort of experiment with methodologies that will allow you to get the most accurate knowledge that you can get, because that's what academics do and what academia does, tries to deliver the most accurate knowledge in a given moment in time. So it's a good challenge, I'd say, but it is definitely a challenge. And another question that I wanted to ask you is about the, you mentioned polytheism, and I was wondering, what is the conceptualization that of deities that you find in Thelema in your experience, but personally, and also what do you think other Thelemites usually think?
Yeah, so I think Thelema is fundamentally emanationist. If you look into Thelema, you're going to notice that things like Kabbalah are heavily emphasized, and our deities, if you look especially at the Book of the Law, you're going to notice I call them like composite deities. You'll notice there's like these sub names that get like switched around, and that sort of changes the aspect of what you're looking at. And so because of those two things, I think it has to be argued that Thelema is essentially a emanation theology, similar to like what people call soft polytheism, where it's essentially like one emanation going through different aspects and creating this refracting concept of deity. So whether it's polytheist or not is depending on how you would even define that. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could make some crazy argument that's monotheist. I wouldn't go that far because of how separate they are, but it's very much aspects of the same emanation through, because if you look at like how we talk about deity, it always comes back to the tree of life, right? We're always like, well, Babylon is Bina. And so if Babylon's Bina, but we've still got other like spirits we work with on different parts of that tree, there's still, as you know how the tree of life works, if you're familiar with anything about Hermetic Kabbalah, it's from the point in the circle emanating down. So inherently it is like an emanation soft polytheist conception, but in practice they do feel rather separate, I've noticed as well, like Nuit and Babylon, right? Nuit and Babylon are different aspects of each other if you get really deep into the Thelemic metaphysics of it. And so it's like, how are those two so different, but they're still aspecting each other in certain ways? And as well, like we correspond like the planets to the spheres of the tree of life. And so that's how I would define it. But I think in practice, when you're working with the spirits, as I do, they feel quite separate, but it's just our metaphysical argument is that soft one. And so because of that, that would mean that other deities outside of the sort of Thelemic pantheon exist, and you can still work with them. And I notice a lot of Thelemites do that as well. So that's my sort of conception of deity that at least I agree with. I've seen other Thelemites make the same argument. So, I mean, I'm sure there are some people who disagree with me, because getting Thelemites to agree on anything is like herding cats. There's going to be some dissenter, but we all have a little bit of a different take. The problem with Thelema is that we're so into like individual thought and doing what thou wilt that we disagree too much that it's almost like annoying. But I guess that's probably what Crowley would have wanted.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, I was thinking that if the deities are seen as an emanation, wouldn't that be more monism than monotheism?
Yeah, no, you can definitely, I don't know exactly what words would best define it. So I think you can put a number of words onto that. I saw someone, I think this was on Twitter, say Thelema's monopolytheism, and I kind of laughed at that. I was like, yeah, I kind of see it. I was like, I don't know what that means for sure. Yeah,
I guess it usually it would depend on what do you think that actually exists. So monism would be the idea that everything is one and all the things that you see are emanations of that oneness. Whereas with monotheism, you have that there is one God that exists, and it's the only God that exists, and then creates other things. So you have the actual existence in reality of what the one God has created and of God. Whereas in monism, you have the sense that even though you see things as separate, in reality, everything is one. So the truth of the matter is that even if you see separation, ultimately that is one thing. And that one thing of which everything is part of is the God or the deity. So that would be a monistic perspective. In that case, you can have interaction with the separate emanations or the separate manifestations of that oneness, but ultimately that is still one thing that actually truly exists. So it's more of an ontological matter. So what is that exists, as opposed to what appears to your senses and what participates in your experience. So there's a distinction that usually is drawn between what is believed to actually exist and what is part of your experience.
Oh,
so
I definitely agree more with monism, for sure. For sure.
So then you see as monism, because you have polytheistic religions that are ultimately monistic, because you find that with some Indian traditions that I have studied before I started working with Western esotericism and paganism. And you have the sense, for instance, that you have different deities, but then the belief is that they are all one and you are one with the deity. So there is no ontological distinction between you as a separate entity and the deity. So that is the monistic idea. And it's, yeah, you find a bit of that even in Neoplatonic understanding and Neoplatonic influences on the occult.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went a bit on a tangent.
No, that was really interesting. No, that was very. I think that there definitely is that. That I think pretty much is similar to what I would believe.
And do you think that other Thelemites also would identify as pagans, or is it something that some Thelemites would identify as pagans and others don't? And have you found that there is a pattern, a common pattern between those who identify as pagans as opposed to those who don't?
Yeah, I find some Thelemites call themselves pagans and others don't. That's one of those things where it kind of depends who you're looking at. And I think it depends on what aspects of, it's something I've noticed, this is just an observation I've had. It depends on what part of Thelema they tend to be the most interested in, how they kind of answer that question. As well, when you get into people, when it gets really complicated, people who are like part of other groups and practices as well. Like I know people who are also into like, who have been like initiated into like Nordic stuff for Wicca or something like that. Then those people almost always call themselves pagan, but they're also a little different than the like typical Thelemite. So it depends on who you're talking to and what they're interested in. So some would, some wouldn't. I notice people who are really into like say Kabbalah or Gnosticism or like the Neoplatonic things that sort of influence Thelema, they tend to not call themselves pagan, whereas people who are really into like the spirits like Nuit and Babylon or whatever tend to identify as pagan more. That's just an observation I've had. There's no like, I don't know exactly how to like taxonomy people, but I've noticed some do and some don't. And I've noticed there are patterns in either of those groups.
Yeah, I think that I was wondering whether, for instance, those who tend to be more solitary tend to identify more as pagans as opposed to those who are more in groups. But yeah, that was just my, because I was thinking whether those who see Thelema more as a ceremonial practice would see that as less of a pagan tradition compared to those who have a more solitary practice and include some elements from other pagan traditions, like Wicca, for instance, celebrating the 8 festivals of the year.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, do you think that that could be the case?
I think that's probably part of it. Like I know for a fact I am influenced by contemporary occultism broadly. Like I know I have that influence on me because that's what I was exposed to first. So obviously that's going to leave an imprint. It's like how older practitioners, no matter what tradition they're in, they tend to have like a slightly Wiccan influence to them just because that's what was pop. Especially people who got into the occult in the 90s. They almost universally have a little bit of Wicca on them, no matter what they identify as. And for me, I have that kind of contemporary neo-paganism because that's what I was exposed to first, sort of, you know, that stuff kind of imprints on you to some extent, what you're exposed to. So I think there's probably a correspondence there. Now that I'm thinking about people I've talked to, that does seem to be a bit of a pattern. I'm just thinking of like people I know. I think so. That would make sense. It's complicated though, how people identify, because Thelemites, sometimes we get a little into the weeds with like definitions and all that. And like, it's like when people argue back and forth whether Thelema is a religion in the traditional sense. And it's like, I answer yes to that question. Some people say no to that question. So it's, I don't know. We like to disagree with each other. That's a very common Thelemic thing to do.
Yeah, and what classifies as a religion is very interesting. And I would say as a religious studies scholar that has a wider impact on society. What I found, and I said even in previous conversations, is that there are practitioners that refuse the term religion because they associate the term religion with Abrahamic religions and monotheistic religions. But religion is not necessarily that. So yeah, but that's an interesting conversation, I think, and it is evolving. But in religious studies circles, definitely religion now doesn't mean at all Abrahamic religion. In fact, you know, if you are a religious studies scholar, you can study paganism, you can study Thelema, you can study you know, occultism. So that still is part of the religious studies umbrella because they are considered to an extent religious practices, even when they identify as spiritual rather than a religion, that is still a question that is somewhat related to the perception of religiosity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because we go back and forth with it, and that's kind of the thing that tends to come up because like I argue heavily that Thelema is a religion, but certain people will be like, well, it's not the same as it's a long conversation. Many people have been having it for years, and I think your perspective makes a lot of sense with that.
And another question that I wanted to ask you is about Magick in Thelema, how important it is in the practice and how important it is in the worldview, in the overall in the overall experience of being a Thelemite.
Yeah, so I would say pretty important. If you get into Thelema, it tends to just be part of it. I guess you could argue, because one of the more common definitions that Thelemites throw around for being a Thelemite is to agree with the ideas of true will and accept the book of the law. I guess if you're using that definition, I know that's one that there's this Thelema guy, Sabazius X, who he's a higher up in the OTO group, and he says this is the definition. It's one that I agree with kind of. So by that definition, I mean, I guess you don't have to practice magic to be a Thelemite, but in reality, I've never met a Thelemite who doesn't engage with magic. And I think you kind of need to some extent, or at least a little bit of it. I don't think you need to be, this is one thing where I do sort of, I guess is a hot take. I don't think you need to be some like expert ceremonial magician to be a Thelemite or like devote your entire life to it. I don't think you need to. I think if you want to do it now and again, and you agree with like true will and well, like that, I would still call you a Thelemite. But I think since our goal as Thelemites is to find our true will, I don't really know how you can do that without at least a little bit of magic. I think you don't need to follow the like Thelema TM rituals, right? You don't need to do exactly what Crowley did. I think that's insane. But I think magic is just so central to what Thelema is. If you go to any Thelemic group, that's part of it. If you talk to any Thelemite, they tend to bring it up. Crowley's work is littered with it. I don't know really in practice how you could be a Thelemite and not engage with magic, especially because it is so ingrained in like the teachings of Thelema. It's like integral to the worldview. It's almost inseparable. But I guess theoretically you could be a Thelemite by the popular definition and not engage with magic. But in reality, I'm not sure how that would actually work, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And you said something quite interesting to me. So why would you say that magic is important to find your true will?
Yeah, so I would make this case because I think the one part where I deviate from saying magic is what you have to do to get true will is I think there's no singular pathway to true will. I think that would defeat the point of true will because we all have our own will. But in Thelema, I mean, true will is sort of given to you. Like it's something you have to discover. And so to discover that, I think you have to do magic in some form. I think that could take the form of like more mysticism type stuff. You know what I mean? But you have to discover it somehow, right? To figure out what that is. And then once you sort of discover your true will, it's not really like answering a question, right? It's very much like something you have to live in alignment with. So you have to continue, discovering and growing with it. So I think you'd need some level of magic. I think that could take on a few forms, though. I don't think there's like a singular way to get there. But I don't know how you could do it without at least some sort of spiritual practice in some form.
And how would you define magic then? Would you use Crowley's classical definition, or do you see that as a bit different from that?
I agree with Crowley's classical definition. That's how I would define it. I think it's a good definition. I think it holds up.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about your answer when it comes to magic and Thelema. And I guess I'd like for you to elaborate more on why magic is so integral to the worldview as well. So what is it about magic that is essential to the worldview of a Thelemite, to how a Thelemite sees the world and how a Thelemite sees themselves?
Yeah, so I think magic is really integral because when you look at what Thelema is, it's essentially a system based around this sort of current that is about discovering your true will and in the end accomplishing the great work, right? And the whole point of it is to follow that, to discover divinity sort of on your own terms. And when you look at like what Thelemites do, it's all very magical. When you look at like how we even view life, right? Like the idea of synchronicities is something that Thelemites will talk about a lot, right? Like you'll notice certain numbers when things are going certain ways, or like signs and symbols and all of that. And that is, I think, a enchanted worldview in and of itself. As well, like there's this concept in Thelema where you try to achieve knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel, which is essentially like a spirit that helps guide and teach you. And that really is a magical thought in and of itself, especially if we talk about how you go about, or at least Thelemites argue that you go about doing that. There's a lot of rituals involved. And if you talk to a Thelemite and say, how do I get involved with Thelema? They're going to tell you to do Liber Resh, which is essentially honoring like solar deities multiple times a day. And that is a magical thing to do. I just think it's in every practice associated with Thelema has magic, and like every single one. I guess saying will before meals doesn't really, but even then it's talking about accomplishing the great work. So it's just, I don't know how you could pull it out. I think the only way you could pull it out would be if you're someone who is what I call them philosophical Thelemites. It's like where they like agree with the philosophies of Thelema, but those people are like 0.0001% Thelemites. So I think unless you're seeing Thelema strictly as a philosophy, which in some aspects Thelema is a philosophy, there's a clear philosophic current to it. So, but otherwise, I mean, every practice we do is magic by our definitions. So I don't know how it could be disconnected.
Yeah, that clarifies, at least to me, clarifies a lot what you meant by how integral it is to also find your true will. Yeah, that's quite fascinating. Thank you for that. Yes. So I guess that in closing, would you like to say anything to my audience, or mention your platforms in case they want to subscribe to them?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was really interesting to discuss with you. I very rarely talk to academics, so it was refreshing. I'm Georgina Rose. I go by .darling, D-A-T, and then Darling, like the pet name. On most platforms, my big thing is my YouTube channel. I'm on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram as well. So I'm on pretty much every social media platform. I don't know which ones I'm not on. I am on Twitch as well. I very rarely use that one, but mostly YouTube. That's like the big place to find me, and TikTok would be the other one. I have serious conversations on my YouTube. My TikTok is mostly memes, but I do both memes and serious discussion. So thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for coming, Georgina. And for the audience watching this, please let me know in the comments what you think about what we thought about, and leave us your thoughts and comments. So this is it for today's video. I hope you liked it. And if you did, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, activate your notification bell so that you will never miss a new upload from me. And as always, stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.